There are wounds that never heal, even when the flesh has mended and the scars have faded to silver threads across your skin. There are betrayals so profound, they change the very essence of who you are, leaving you hollow where wholeness once lived. And there are bonds so sacred that even death itself cannot truly sever them, though sometimes we wish it could. I am Celine Arden, and I was broken on a night when the moon bled crimson across the sky. 6 months ago, beneath the cruel glow of that blood-red orb, I knelt in the great hall of Castle Vorin, while the man I loved, the future king I had been promised to since childhood, spoke words that shattered my very soul. "You are not mine," he declared, his golden eyes cold as winter stars. "You have never been mine." The bond that should have lasted until my final breath snapped like a chain under impossible strain, and I collapsed to the marble floor as my wolf died inside me. They say an Omega cannot survive the rejection of her destined mate. They say the pain alone should have killed me, that any wolf with dignity would have let it. For months I believed them. I scrubbed floors where I had once danced, served meals in halls where I had been meant to rule, and buried my broken heart so deep I forgot it had ever beaten for another. But the moon goddess, it seems, is not finished with me yet. Tonight, as shadow creatures tear through our defenses and ancient enemies wake from their slumber, I feel it stirring again. That impossible connection I thought had died forever. The bond pulses beneath my skin like a second heartbeat, calling me toward a destiny I no longer understand, and a power I never knew I possessed. Alaric Vorin destroyed me once to save me from something worse. Now, as our world burns around us and darkness closes in from every side, I must decide whether to trust the man who broke my heart with the power to heal it. Because some stories don't end with rejection and exile. Some stories are just beginning when love seems lost forever. And sometimes, the very thing that nearly destroys us becomes the only thing powerful enough to save everything we hold dear. The blood moon is rising again. This time, nothing will ever be the same. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The scent of ancient blood still lingered in the stones of the Great Hall, even after so many months. Celine Arden scrubbed the marble floor with mechanical movements, her calloused fingers gripping the soaked cloth as she tried to erase the stains that stubbornly remained. Some marks never come out completely. She had learned that on her own skin. The ghost of that night haunted every corner of this hall. She could still see the crimson moonlight streaming through the tall windows, painting everything in shades of violence and betrayal. The memory of her own blood pooling beneath her, as the bond snapped like a broken chain, was so vivid that sometimes she couldn't tell if the stains on the floor were real or just echoes of her trauma. "More force, Omega," growled Mira Blackthorn, the governess who supervised the castle servants. The woman's voice carried the particular cruelty that came from someone who had once been nothing herself, and now wielded what little power she could over those beneath her. "The Royal Council arrives tomorrow, and we will not tolerate imperfections." Mira's eyes lingered on Celine with obvious distaste. Everyone knew what she was, the Omega who had been publicly rejected by their king, the broken wolf who somehow still drew breath, despite having her very soul torn in half. Some servants whispered that she should have died that night, that any wolf with dignity would have. Others said she was cursed, that her continued existence was an insult to the moon goddess herself. Celine assent you without lifting her eyes. Speaking would only attract more attention, more pain. Since the night of the blood moon, since he broke her before everyone, she had learned that silence was her only protection. Words were weapons that could be turned against her, and she had no defenses left. "You are not mine. You have never been mine. Whatever bond you imagined between us was nothing but a child's delusion." The words echoed in her mind like a wound that refused to heal. 6 months had already passed since Alaric Vorin, then Crown Prince, declared before the entire court that he rejected their destined bond. 6 months since the physical pain of the rupture made her collapse on the cold floor of this same hall, blood trickling from her nose while her inner wolf slowly died. But it hadn't been just the bond's breaking that shattered her. It was the way he'd looked at her in that moment, not with regret or even anger, but with complete indifference, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience he was finally free to discard. The boy she had loved since childhood, the future king she had dreamed of standing beside, had erased her with the casual ease of someone brushing dust from their sleeve. Now he was the Alpha King, crowned in a ceremony she had watched from the servants' quarters, her heart breaking anew with each cheer from the crowd. And she was nothing, less than nothing, a reminder of his humanity that he had cast aside in pursuit of greater power. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had been born for this, raised and trained from childhood to be the perfect mate for the future king. Her bloodline was pure, her wolf strong despite her Omega status. The old prophecies had spoken of a union between the Arden and Vorin lines that would bring unprecedented strength to the kingdom. But prophecies, it seemed, meant little when weighed against political necessity. Selene. Lyra Ashworth's soft voice made her lift her head. The only friend she had left stood in the hall's entrance, her blonde hair tied in a simple bun. There was something different in Lyra's expression today, a tension that made Selene's stomach clench with dread. Finish this later. There's something you need to know. The urgent tone made Selene immediately abandon the cloth. She followed Lyra through the stone corridors, noting how the other servants averted their eyes as they passed. It had been like this for months now, as if her broken bond made her contagious, as if looking directly at her might somehow curse them with the same fate. They passed through the servants' quarters, where the walls were bare stone, and the air carried the permanent scent of lye soap and desperation. This was her world now, narrow corridors and windowless rooms, a far cry from the luxurious chambers she had once been destined to occupy as queen. They reached the small room Selene shared with 3 other Omegas. The space was cramped, with only 4 narrow beds and a single window overlooking the inner courtyard. Her few possessions fit in a small wooden chest at the foot of her bed, a stark contrast to the life of privilege she had known before her fall from grace. "They've closed the borders," Lyra whispered as soon as the door shut behind them, checking to make sure none of their roommates were present. "All of them. Royal order as of this morning." Selene felt her mouth go dry. Why? War. The word fell like a stone between them. Lyra's hands trembled as she spoke. "The Shadow Wolves have allied with the Iron Crows. Intelligence reports say they're marching toward the kingdom with an army unlike anything we've ever seen." The blood in Selene's veins turned to ice. The Shadow Wolves were creatures of legend and nightmare. Wolves who had given up their humanity so completely that they could no longer take human form. They were larger, stronger, and more vicious than any natural wolf, driven by an insatiable hunger for destruction. And the Iron Crows, they were said to be wolves who had undergone dark rituals, binding metal to their bones and poison to their claws. Together, they formed a force that could tear through any pack's defenses like paper. "How long do we have?" Selene asked, her voice barely audible. "Days, maybe weeks if we're fortunate." Lyra sat heavily on her bed, the mattress creaking under her weight. "They say King Alaric is gathering every able-bodied wolf in the kingdom. Every alpha, every beta, even the younger gammas are being called to service. The largest army our people have ever assembled. Every wolf except us," Selene finished bitterly. Lyra nodded, her expression grim. In times of war, Omegas were considered liabilities rather than assets. They would be locked away in the deepest parts of the castle, protected like precious objects until the fighting ended, if it ever did. The idea of being trapped in these stone walls while the world burned around them filled Selene with a claustrophobia so intense she could barely breathe. "There's something else," Lyra continued, her voice dropping even lower. "Something the servants are whispering about." Selene waited, though part of her didn't want to know. Bad news seemed to follow her like a shadow these days. "They're saying the king is different since the coronation, colder, more ruthless." Lyra's green eyes were troubled. "There are rumors that he's been meeting with practitioners of the old magic, seeking ways to enhance our warriors' strength. Some say he's becoming as much monster as the enemies we face." The words hit Selene like a physical blow. The Alaric she had known, the boy who had once picked wildflowers with her in the castle gardens, who had shared his deepest fears about becoming king, would never have consorted with dark magic. But then again, that same boy had destroyed her without hesitation when it served his purposes. A sudden commotion in the courtyard made both women rush to the window. Below, royal guards were forming ranks in perfect military precision, while servants hurried about with supplies and weapons. The organized chaos of an army preparing for war filled the air with tension so thick it was almost tangible. But what made Selene's heart stop was the figure standing in the center of it all, Alaric Vorin. Even from this distance, she could feel the power radiating from him like heat from a forge. He had grown taller and broader since becoming king, his shoulders carrying the weight of crown and kingdom with an authority that was both magnificent and terrible. His dark hair was longer now, swept back from his face in a way that emphasized the sharp angles of his cheekbones and jaw. The royal armor he wore was a masterwork of black steel and silver, designed to intimidate as much as protect. When he turned in their direction, she caught a glimpse of the golden eyes that had once looked at her with something resembling love. But now they held only the cold calculation of a predator, scanning the castle's defenses with the detached efficiency of a military commander. This was not the boy she had loved. This was the Alpha King, and he was every inch the fearsome ruler their people needed him to be. "He's leaving tonight," Lyra whispered, her breath fogging the glass, leading the army himself instead of sending his generals. Celine pressed her palm against the cool window, watching as he mounted his massive black stallion. The horse was a magnificent beast, bred for war and nearly as imposing as its rider. Around them, hundreds of wolves in human form prepared to shift for the long run ahead, their movements coordinated with the precision that spoke of months of intensive training. Part of her, the part that had never truly healed, that still remembered what it felt like to be cherished by him, wanted to run down there, to see his face one more time before he rode off to what might be his death. She wanted to touch his hand, to wish him victory, to remind him that despite everything, someone still cared whether he lived or died. But the larger part, the part that remembered the crushing pain of rejection and the months of humiliation that followed, kept her frozen in place. "Good," she said, surprised by the venom in her own voice. "Maybe the Shadow Wolves will finish what he started." Lyra gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Celine, you don't mean that." But as they watched the king's army disappear into the gathering darkness, Celine wasn't sure what she meant anymore. The bond between them had been severed, yes, but something else remained, a phantom pain that never quite went away, a constant reminder of what she had lost. Sometimes she wondered if it would have been kinder if the rejection had killed her outright, as it should have. The night deepened around them as they returned to their beds. Her other roommates, Petra, Dahlia, and young Wren, filtered in one by one, their faces showing the strain of the day's revelations. Conversations were muted, filled with the kind of desperate hope that comes when there's nothing else left to cling to. Hours passed in fitful attempts at sleep. The castle settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that comes before storms. Celine lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to ignore the strange restlessness that had been growing inside her all evening. It started as a tingle in her fingertips, then spread up her arms like electricity racing through her veins. Her wolf, which had been dormant since the rejection, barely more than a whisper in the back of her mind, suddenly stirred for the first time in months. The sensation was so unexpected that Celine sat up abruptly, her heart racing as power she had thought lost forever began to pulse beneath her skin. "What's wrong?" Lyra asked from the next bed, her voice heavy with exhaustion. Before Celine could answer, a howl pierced the night air, then another, and another. The sound was wrong, not the organized calls of scouts or sentries, but wild, desperate cries that spoke of terror and death. The very walls seemed to vibrate with the anguish in those voices. "They're here," Celine breathed, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. The castle erupted into chaos. Shouts echoed through the corridors as servants and guards ran in all directions, their footsteps creating a thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations. Through the window, Celine could see fires blazing in the distance, growing larger by the minute as they consumed everything in their path. "The king's army," Lyra said, her face pale with realization and horror. They were ambushed. A tremendous crash shook the entire castle as something massive struck the main gates. The sound of splintering wood and screaming metal filled the air as the first line of defense crumbled. Then came more impacts, methodical, devastating, each one bringing their enemies closer to the heart of the castle. "We need to hide." Lyra grabbed Celine's arm with desperate strength, but she pulled away. "No." The word came out stronger than Celine had intended, surprising them both. For months she had hidden, cowered, accepted whatever scraps of existence others deemed fit to throw her way. But now, with death itself hammering at their doors, something fierce and primal was awakening inside her. "I'm tired of hiding. Celine, please." Another crash, closer this time. The Shadow Wolves had breached the outer defenses, and were now somewhere inside the castle walls. Soon they would be here, in these very chambers, and no amount of hiding would save anyone. That's when Celine felt it, a burning sensation in her chest, right where the bond had been severed. It was impossible. The connection was broken, dead, gone forever in a ritual of rejection that should have been irreversible. Yet something was pulling at her, calling her toward the great hall with an urgency that made her bones ache. "I have to go," she said, moving toward the door with steps that felt guided by forces beyond her understanding. "Go where?" "Celine, you're scaring me." But Celine was already running, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone as she raced through corridors filled with screaming servants and panicked guards. The burning in her chest grew stronger with each step until it felt like her ribs might crack from the pressure. Behind her, she could hear Lyra calling her name, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. The familiar corridors blurred past her as she ran, the same paths she had walked as a servant, as a rejected mate, as something less than nothing. But now each step felt different, charged with purpose she couldn't name but dared not ignore. She burst through the doors of the great hall just as a section of the wall exploded inward. Stone and mortar rained down like hail as massive shapes poured through the breach. Wolves the size of horses, their eyes glowing red in the firelight, and their jaws dripping with blood and saliva. Their howls filled the air with a sound like breaking glass, and the stench of sulfur and death rolled off them in waves. And standing in the center of the destruction, his royal armor torn and bloodied, but his sword still gleaming in his hand, was Alaric Vorin. Their eyes met across the chaos of battle, and Celine felt the world tilt on its axis. Time seemed to slow as recognition flashed between them, not just of faces, but of something deeper. The severed bond, the one that should have been dead and buried beneath months of careful emotional scar tissue, suddenly flared to life like a flame touched to kindling. The sensation was overwhelming, not just the return of connection, but the flood of his emotions crashing into her consciousness like a tidal wave. His shock at seeing her here, his desperate fear for her safety, his rage at the enemies surrounding them, and beneath it all, something else, something that felt almost like... Alaric's golden eyes widened in shock, his lips parting as if to speak her name. But before either of them could move, before either could process what was happening between them, a shadow wolf the size of a building launched itself through the air, its massive jaws snapping where Celine's head had been moments before. She rolled to the side, her dormant wolf finally awakening as adrenaline flooded her system. When she looked up again, Alaric was fighting 3 enemies at once, his sword gleaming as it cut through their ranks with deadly precision. "Celine!" he shouted over the din of battle, his voice carrying both command and desperate plea. "Get out of here." But she couldn't move, couldn't think. Because as impossible as it seemed, she could feel him again. His fear, his determination, his desperate need to protect her even now, even after everything that had happened between them. The bond between them wasn't just reawakening. It was stronger than it had ever been, pulsing with a power that made her previous connection to him seem like a pale shadow, and that terrified her more than any enemy ever could. The shadow wolf's claws scraped against stone where Celine's head had been a heartbeat before. She rolled behind a fallen pillar, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The beast that had nearly taken her life was unlike anything she had ever seen, larger than any natural wolf, with fur that seemed to absorb light and eyes that burned like coals in a forge. But it wasn't the monster that made her hands shake. It was the impossible sensation burning in her chest, the phantom limb of a severed bond that should have been dead coming roaring back to life with a vengeance. This can't be happening. Across the hall, Alaric moved like death itself, his sword cutting through Shadow Wolf after Shadow Wolf, with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. But even as she watched him fight, Celine could feel his emotions bleeding through the reawakened connection, his shock at seeing her here, his terror that she would be hurt, and underneath it all, something that felt dangerously like relief. Relief that she was alive, relief that she was here, relief that whatever had been broken between them wasn't as permanent as they'd both believed. A howl shattered her concentration. The shadow wolf that had attacked her was circling back, its massive head swiveling as it searched for her scent. Its movements were wrong somehow, too fluid, too intelligent. These weren't just large wolves. They were something else entirely, something that wore wolf shape but carried the cunning of men. "Behind the altar," a voice commanded. Celine spun to find a figure in black armor standing near her hiding spot. For a moment, her heart leaped, thinking it was Alaric, but this man was shorter, stockier, with steel-gray hair visible beneath his helm. "Commander Garrett," she breathed, recognizing one of the king's most trusted generals. "Move, girl." Garrett grabbed her arm and hauled her toward the massive stone altar at the far end of the hall. This is no place for servants. But as they ran, dodging falling debris and the massive paws of battling wolves, Celine felt something shift inside her. The burning in her chest was spreading, flowing through her veins like molten gold. Her Omega wolf, dormant for so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be whole, was stirring with unprecedented strength. They reached the altar, just as another section of wall exploded. This time, what came through wasn't shadow wolves but something worse. Iron crows. These wolves had undergone dark rituals that fused metal to their bones and poison to their claws. Their howls carried the sound of grinding gears, and when they moved, sparks flew from where their metallic parts scraped against stone. "How many of them are there?" Celine gasped, pressing herself against the cold marble. "Too many," Garrett replied grimly, fitting an arrow to his bow. "The king's army was decimated in the ambush. What you see here are the survivors." The words hit her like a physical blow. Decimated. Most of Alaric's army was dead or dying somewhere in the darkness beyond the castle walls. The flower of their kingdom's warriors had been cut down, and now these monsters were here to finish what they'd started. A familiar voice rang out across the chaos, carrying the authority of absolute command. "Fall back to the throne room. Protect the civilians." Alaric, even in the midst of battle, his first concern was for the people under his protection. The servants, the Omegas, the children, those who couldn't fight, but were depending on him to keep them safe. But as Celine watched him fight his way toward them, she saw blood streaming from a dozen wounds. His armor was cracked and dented, and there was a set to his shoulders that spoke of exhaustion so profound, it was a miracle he was still standing. "He won't last much longer," she whispered, the words torn from her throat before she could stop them. Garrett followed her gaze and nodded grimly. "The king fights like 10 men, but even he has limits. And these creatures," he shook his head, "they're not just stronger than normal wolves. They're smarter, coordinated. This isn't a raid. It's a surgical strike designed to cut the head off our kingdom." Another crash echoed through the hall as more enemies poured through the breach. Celine could see humans among them now, traitors who had allied themselves with the shadow wolves and iron crows. Their faces were painted with symbols that hurt to look at directly, and they moved with the same wrong fluidity as their monstrous allies. That's when she felt it. A pulling sensation so strong it nearly knocked her off her feet. The bond between her and Alaric wasn't just reawakened. It was doing something, changing something. Power flowed through the connection, but it wasn't coming from him to her. It was going the other way. She was giving him strength. "Impossible," she breathed, staring at her hands. They were glowing with a soft silver light that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. Garrett followed her gaze and his weathered face went white. "By the moon goddess, you're one of them." "One of what?" "The amplifiers. The lost bloodline." His voice was full of awe and terror in equal measure. "We thought they were all dead." Before Celine could ask what he meant, a shadow wolf landed on the altar beside them with enough force to crack the ancient stone. Its red eyes fixed on her with an intelligence that made her skin crawl, and when it spoke, its voice was like grinding gravel. "The little Omega glows," it rumbled, saliva dripping from fangs the size of daggers. "The master will be very interested in her." It lunged forward, claws extended to tear her apart. But instead of impact, there was an explosion of silver light that sent the creature flying across the hall to crash into the far wall with bone-shattering force. The light had come from Celine. Silence fell over the battlefield for a heartbeat, as every eye turned toward the altar where she stood. The silver radiance around her was growing stronger, and she could feel power, unlike anything she'd ever imagined flowing through her veins. "Celine." Alaric's voice cut through the stunned quiet, and she turned to see him fighting his way toward her with desperate urgency. But it wasn't just concern in his eyes. It was recognition. He knew what this meant. The shadow wolves recovered from their shock first. With howls that shook dust from the ceiling, they abandoned their individual fights and converged on the altar like a black tide, dozens of them. all focused on reaching her before she could fully understand or control whatever was happening to her. "Protect her!" Alaric roared, but his remaining men were scattered and outnumbered. There was no way they could hold back so many enemies. That's when the true magnitude of what was happening hit her. These creatures hadn't come here just to destroy the kingdom. They'd come for her. Somehow they'd known what she was before she'd known it herself. The first wave reached the altar's steps. Garrett stepped forward to meet them, his sword flashing in the silver light, but Celine could see it was hopeless. There were too many, and they were too strong. The burning in her chest reached a crescendo, and suddenly she understood. The power wasn't just flowing from her to Alaric anymore. It was flowing to every defender in the hall. The surviving guards and soldiers suddenly moved faster, struck harder, their wounds healing even as they fought. But the effort was enormous. She could feel her strength draining away like water through a broken dam. Whatever this power was, she didn't know how to control it, and it was consuming her from the inside out. "I don't know how to stop it," she gasped, falling to her knees as the silver light around her flickered. "Don't stop." Alaric's voice was suddenly beside her, and she looked up to see him standing over her, his sword keeping the nearest enemies at bay. "Don't ever stop. Do you understand me? I don't know what's happening. You're saving us all." His golden eyes met hers for just a moment, and in them she saw the boy she'd once loved alongside the king he'd become. "You're saving the entire kingdom." A shadow wolf broke through Alaric's guard, its claws raking across his chest with enough force to send him stumbling backward. Blood sprayed across the altar's steps, and Celine felt his pain like a physical blow through their renewed bond. That's when something inside her snapped. The silver light exploded outward with enough force to shatter every window in the hall. Shadow wolves were flung against walls like rag dolls, and the Iron Crow's metallic enhancements began to smoke and melt under the pure energy washing over them. But more than that, something fundamental had changed. The bond between her and Alaric was no longer just reawakened. It was transformed, enhanced beyond anything that should have been possible. She could feel not just his emotions, but his thoughts, his memories, even his wolf's primal instincts. And through that connection, she felt something that made her heart stop. He had never wanted to reject her. The night of the blood moon, the cruel words, the public humiliation, none of it had been his choice. Someone else had been controlling him, forcing him to break their bond to prevent exactly this from happening. Someone had known what she was, what she could become. "Alaric," she whispered, reaching for him as the silver light around her began to fade. But before their hands could touch, before she could tell him what she'd learned, darkness crashed over her like a wave. The last thing she saw was his face, twisted with anguish, as he caught her falling form. The last thing she heard was his voice, broken and desperate. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Celine. Sorry. I never wanted—" Then there was nothing but the void, and the distant sound of battle raging on without her. When consciousness returned, it came slowly, like swimming up from the bottom of a deep, dark lake. Celine's first sensation was warmth, not the heat of fever, but the gentle warmth of sunlight and soft blankets. Her second was the complete absence of pain. She opened her eyes to find herself in a room she didn't recognize. It wasn't the servants' quarters where she'd been living, nor was it any part of the castle she'd ever seen. The walls were made of smooth white stone that seemed to glow with its own inner light, and the ceiling was painted with constellations that moved slowly across the surface like living stars. "You're awake." The voice made her turn her head, wincing slightly as unused muscles protested. A woman sat beside the bed, elderly, with silver hair braided with small bells that chimed softly when she moved. Her eyes were the pale blue of winter ice, and when they fixed on Celine, they seemed to see everything. "Who are you?" Celine asked, her voice coming out as barely more than a croak. "My name is Moira Ravencrest," the woman replied, rising from her chair to pour water from a crystal pitcher into a matching cup. Let us say I am someone who has been waiting a very long time to meet you, Celine Arden." The name Ravencrest sent a chill through Celine's bones. She'd heard it whispered in the darkest corners of the castle, stories of a witch who served neither light nor dark, but something far older and more dangerous. "How long have I been unconscious?" 3 days, Moira said, offering her the cup. "The battle is over. The Shadow Wolves and Iron Crows have withdrawn, though I suspect this was merely a probing attack. They learned what they came to learn." Celine sat up carefully, accepting the water with hands that trembled only slightly. And what was that? that the last of the amplifiers still lives, that the old bloodlines haven't died out completely. Moira's pale eyes studied Selene with uncomfortable intensity, that there is still hope for this world, though it comes at a price neither you nor your king understand yet. I don't understand any of this, Selene said, frustration bleeding into her voice. What's an amplifier? Why did those things come here for me? And what happened to the bond between Alaric and me? Moira was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the arm of her chair in a rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of centuries. Long ago, when magic was young and the barriers between worlds were thin, certain bloodlines were blessed by the moon goddess herself. These families could amplify the power of others, particularly those they were bonded to. An alpha mated to an amplifier became capable of feats that bordered on godlike. Armies could be healed with a thought. Enemies could be turned to ash with a gesture. The very earth itself would bend to their combined will. She paused, her eyes growing distant. But such power attracts attention from dark places, the Shadow Realm, where nightmares take physical form and ancient hungers wait to be fed. The amplifiers became targets, hunted not just for what they could do, but for what they could be made to do in the wrong hands. Selena felt her blood turn cold. Made to do? An amplifier's power can be corrupted, twisted to serve purposes their own heart would never choose. The Shadow Wolves didn't come here to kill you, child. They came to take you, to break you in ways that would make you willing to amplify their dark masters instead of your chosen mate. The water cup slipped from Selene's numb fingers, shattering on the stone floor. That's why Alaric rejected me. Someone told him what I was. Someone told him what would happen if your bond fully awakened while you were unprepared. Moira corrected gently. The rejection was meant to keep you safe until you could be properly trained. Unfortunately, war has a way of forcing events before their time. But the bond came back stronger than before. I felt it during the battle. Moira nodded slowly. That is because it was never truly broken. The rejection suppressed it, forced it into dormancy. But the connection between true mates cannot be permanently severed by words alone. When your life was in danger, when his life was in danger, the bond reasserted itself with all the strength it should have had from the beginning. Selene struggled to process everything she was hearing. The boy she'd loved had never betrayed her. He'd been trying to save her. The humiliation, the pain, the months of believing herself worthless, all of it had been a lie designed to protect her from something worse. Where is he now? She asked, dealing with the aftermath of battle, mourning his dead, trying to prepare for the war that is surely coming. Moira's expression grew grave. The Shadow Wolves may have withdrawn, but they accomplished their primary objective. They confirmed that you exist, that your power is awakening, and that you are here and relatively defenseless. Defenseless? But I drove them back. You nearly killed yourself in the process, Moira interrupted sharply. Raw power without training is like a sword without a hilt, as dangerous to the wielder as to their enemies. You need to learn control, discipline, focus, and you need to learn it quickly. Selene swung her legs over the side of the bed, testing her strength. She felt weak, but not dangerously so, though there was something different about her body now. The wolf that had been dormant for so long was fully awake, and with it came a sense of wholeness she hadn't felt since that terrible night 6 months ago. How long do we have? To train you properly? Years? To prepare you for what's coming? Moira's smile was sharp as a blade. Days, perhaps weeks if we're fortunate. The Shadow King won't wait long before making his next move, and when he does, it will be with everything he has. Shadow King? The master the creatures spoke of, the one who rules the Shadow Realm and hungers for our world. Moira stood, her movements fluid despite her apparent age. He has been searching for an amplifier for centuries, and now he knows exactly where to find one. The weight of it all threatened to crush Selene where she sat. An ancient enemy wanted to use her for purposes she couldn't imagine. A war was coming that could destroy everything she'd ever known. And somewhere in the castle above them, Alaric was dealing with all of this while believing she was unconscious and helpless. I need to see him, she said, standing despite the tremor in her legs. Alaric, I need to tell him that I know the truth. You will, Moira assured her. But first, you need to see what you've become. She gestured toward a mirror hanging on the far wall, a mirror that Selene was certain hadn't been there moments before. When she looked into its silver surface, she gasped. Her reflection showed the same face, the same body, but everything about her seemed more. Her brown hair held streaks of silver that caught the light like threads of moonbeam. Her eyes, once a simple hazel, now held flecks of gold that seemed to swirl and dance. And beneath her skin, just visible if she looked carefully, veins of silver light pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. "The awakening has changed you," Moira explained. "You are no longer simply Omega or simply human. You are something new, something that hasn't existed in this world for over 1,000 years. What am I?" "You are hope," Moira said simply. "And you are also the most dangerous weapon either side of this war could possess." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Moira's head tilted, listening to something Celine couldn't hear. "He's here," the witch said with a knowing smile. "Your king grows impatient." Before Celine could ask what she meant, the door opened to reveal Alaric himself, but this wasn't the battle-weary warrior she'd seen fighting in the great hall. He was clean, dressed in simple clothes instead of armor, and the wounds she'd seen covering his body were nowhere to be visible. Only the haunted look in his golden eyes remained. Their gazes met across the room, and Celine felt the bond between them flare to life like touching a live wire. But this time, instead of pain or confusion, there was something else. Recognition. Understanding. And beneath it all, a love that had never truly died despite everything that had tried to kill it. "Celine," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. "I know," she said, the words covering everything that needed to be said between them. "I know why you did it. I know you didn't want to. I know you were trying to protect me." Something in his expression cracked, and suddenly he was across the room, pulling her into his arms with desperate intensity. The bond sang between them, stronger and clearer than it had ever been, carrying emotions too complex for words. His relief that she was alive, his agony over the months they'd lost, his terror over what was coming, his determination to keep her safe no matter the cost. And underneath it all, the unshakable certainty that they belonged together, that whatever they faced, they would face it as one. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm so sorry for what I put you through. If there had been any other way—" "I know," she repeated, pulling back to look into his face. "And now we face whatever comes next together." Behind them, Moira cleared her throat delicately. "How touching. But perhaps we could save the reunion for after we discuss how to keep you both alive through the war that's coming." Alaric's arms tightened around Celine, and she could feel his protective instincts flaring through their bond. "She's not fighting in this war." "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make," Moira replied with amusement. "She is the war, my dear king. Everything that follows will revolve around her, and what she chooses to do with the power awakening inside her. Then we need to know everything," Celine said, stepping out of Alaric's embrace but keeping hold of his hand. "About my bloodline, about this Shadow King, about what's really at stake here." Moira nodded approvingly. "Finally, the right questions. Very well. But I warn you, once you know the truth, there will be no going back to the life either of you imagined you would have." "Our old life ended 6 months ago," Alaric said grimly. "We're ready for whatever comes next." Moira's smile was sharp and sad at the same time. "We shall see, young king. We shall see." The War Council chamber had been transformed overnight. What was once a room lined with elegant tapestries and polished oak now resembled something between a fortress command center and an arcane laboratory. Maps covered every surface, marked with red ink that looked disturbingly like blood. Crystals hummed with contained energy from various corners, and the air itself seemed to thicken with barely restrained power. Celine stood beside Alaric at the head of the massive table, acutely aware that every eye in the room was fixed on her. The assembled nobles, generals, and advisors couldn't seem to decide whether she was their salvation or their doom. Perhaps both, she thought grimly. It had been 3 weeks since her awakening, 3 weeks of intensive training with Moira that had pushed her body and mind to their absolute limits. She could now channel her power without collapsing, could amplify Alaric's abilities without burning herself out, and most importantly, she could sense the approach of Shadow Realm creatures from miles away. What she couldn't do was shake the feeling that they were already too late. "The reports are confirmed," Commander Garrett announced, his weathered face grave as he pointed to the largest map spread across the table. 3 more border settlements have fallen. The pattern is always the same. The Shadow Wolves strike at sunset, the Iron Crows finish any survivors, and by dawn there's nothing left but ash and silence. How many dead? Alaric's voice was carefully controlled, but Selene could feel his rage burning through their bond like acid in her veins. 600 confirmed, perhaps twice that number missing. General Blackwood, a stern woman whose gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, traced the attack routes with one scarred finger. They're not just raiding anymore, Your Majesty. They're systematically clearing a path directly toward the capital. Selene studied the map, noting the deliberate progression of the attacks. They're hurting us, she said quietly, forcing refugees into the capital, stretching our resources, creating chaos. To what end? Asked Lord Ashford, one of the younger nobles whose family controlled the kingdom's grain supplies. Before anyone could answer, Moira spoke from her position near the room's single window. To weaken you before the final strike. The Shadow King doesn't want a quick victory. He wants total surrender. He wants your people broken, desperate, ready to accept any salvation offered to them, even if that salvation comes from the very monsters attacking them. Alaric finished grimly. Precisely. Moira turned from the window, her pale eyes reflecting the afternoon light in ways that made several of the assembled lords shift uncomfortably. Fear makes people willing to compromise their principles. Desperation makes them eager to trade freedom for safety. And when the Shadow King finally reveals himself, he won't come as a conqueror. He'll come as a savior. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Selene felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. You're saying he'll offer to stop the attacks in exchange for… what? For you, child. Moira's smile was sharp as a blade. He'll demand you be turned over to him in exchange for peace. And after weeks of watching their loved ones die, many of your people will see it as a reasonable trade. Never. Alaric's voice carried the full authority of an Alpha King, and several of the assembled nobles unconsciously straightened in their chairs. I will burn this kingdom to ash before I let him touch her. That may be exactly what he's counting on, Moira replied mildly. A king who would sacrifice his entire kingdom for one woman? The people would turn against you both. Selene felt Alaric's emotions spike through their bond. Frustration, helplessness, and underneath it all, a fear so profound it made her stomach clench. He was caught between his duty to his people and his need to protect her, and the Shadow King knew it. There has to be another way, she said, studying the maps again. Some weakness we can exploit. There is, Commander Garrett said reluctantly, but you're not going to like it. All eyes turned to him, and the grizzled soldiers seemed to shrink under the collective attention. The attacks have a pattern, yes, but there's something else. Something we've been tracking but haven't wanted to acknowledge. He pulled out a smaller map, this one marked with dates and times. Every attack happens at sunset, but not just any sunset. They're timed to coincide with specific lunar phases. And the progression, he swallowed hard. They're moving toward the capital in a perfect spiral. Moira went very still. Show me that map. Garrett handed it over, and the witch studied it for long moments while the room held its breath. When she finally looked up, her face was pale. It's a summoning circle, she whispered. They're not just clearing a path to the capital. They're using the deaths, the destruction, the terror. They're using it all to weaken the barriers between our world and the Shadow Realm. To what end? General Blackwood demanded. To bring the Shadow King himself through, Alaric said, his voice hollow with realization. Not just his creatures, him, Moira nodded grimly. When the spiral is complete, when enough blood has been spilled in the right pattern, the barrier will collapse entirely. He'll be able to manifest here in his full power, not just as a projection or through possessed creatures. Lord Ashford's face had gone white. How long do we have? Moira consulted the map again, her fingers tracing the spiral pattern. If the attacks continue at their current pace, 2 weeks, perhaps less. The silence that followed was deafening. 2 weeks to save not just their kingdom, but their entire world from a force that had been building power for centuries. There is one option, Selene said suddenly, an idea crystallizing in her mind even as she spoke. What if we don't wait for him to come to us? Meaning? Alaric's tone was carefully neutral, but she could feel his alarm through their bond. The spiral works both ways, doesn't it? She looked at Moira. If their attacks are weakening the barriers, then those same weak points could be used to go the other direction. Understanding dawned in the witch's pale eyes. Into the Shadow Realm itself. Strike at the source before the summoning is complete. Absolutely not. Alaric's voice cut through the room like a blade. It's too dangerous. More dangerous than letting him manifest here? Celine turned to face him fully, noting how the other attendees suddenly found the maps extremely interesting. Alaric, if he gains a foothold in our world, if you die in his realm, our world falls anyway. The words exploded out of him with enough force to make several people flinch. You're the only thing standing between him and total victory. Without you, without your power, we have no defense against what he can do. And with me hiding behind these walls while our people die, we're just delaying the inevitable. Celine reached for his hand, feeling the bond pulse between them. We can't win by playing defense. We both know that. Through their connection, she felt his emotions war with each other. His logical mind knew she was right, but every protective instinct he possessed was screaming at him to keep her safe, to find another way, to sacrifice anything else before risking her. There might be a compromise, Moira said carefully. The ritual circles they're creating. If we could disrupt them before the spiral is complete, it would buy us time, perhaps enough time to find another solution. Commander Garrett leaned forward. What kind of disruption are we talking about? The circles are powered by death and terror, yes, but they're also anchored to physical locations. Specific sites where the barriers between worlds are naturally thin. Moira pulled out yet another map, this one showing ley lines that crisscross the kingdom like a spider's web. There are 3 primary anchor points left. If we could reach them, if we could cleanse them, it would break the entire pattern, General Blackwood finished. Scatter the accumulated power and force them to start over. Exactly. And starting over would take months, perhaps years, time enough to prepare proper defenses, to train more amplifiers if any others survive in distant bloodlines. Hope flickered in Celine's chest, but it was tempered by the grim reality of their situation. These anchor points, they'll be heavily defended. Undoubtedly, Moira agreed. The Shadow King won't leave his most important assets unprotected. Each site will likely be surrounded by shadow wolves, iron crows, and worse things that haven't revealed themselves yet. Worse things? Lord Ashford asked faintly. The creatures we've seen so far are merely foot soldiers, the witch explained with clinical detachment. The Shadow King has servants that make shadow wolves look like puppies. Things that existed before the first human drew breath. Things that hunger for the destruction of all light and warmth and hope. The room fell silent again, as everyone absorbed the magnitude of what they were facing. Then Alaric straightened, his expression hardening into the mask of absolute authority that had carried him through the darkest days of his reign. We'll take them one at a time, he announced. Fast strikes, minimal forces, in and out before they can respond in strength. We, Celine raised an eyebrow. You're not going alone, and you're not staying behind. She squeezed his hand. We're stronger together. You know that. Through their bond, she felt his resignation warring with his fear. He knew she was right. Their combined power was exponentially greater than what either could achieve alone. But the risk, if something happens to you, he said quietly, if I lose you again, you won't. She brought his hand to her lips, pressing a gentle kiss to his knuckles. We'll face this together, just like we faced everything else. Together. Commander Garrett cleared his throat awkwardly. If I may, Your Majesties, we'll need to move quickly. Our scouts report increased activity around all 3 sites. Whatever they're planning for the final phase, it's accelerating. Moira nodded agreement. The Shadow King can sense that his prey is learning to fight back. He'll want to complete the summoning before you can fully master your abilities. Then we leave at first light, Alaric decided. Garrett, I want our fastest riders and best fighters. Blackwood, coordinate with the remaining garrisons. They'll need to hold the capital while we're gone. And if we fail? Lord Ashford asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Then we make sure our failure costs him dearly, Selene said, surprising herself with the steel in her own voice. If the kingdom falls, it won't be because we gave up without a fight. The meeting dissolved into urgent planning sessions as maps were studied, supply lists compiled, and strategic decisions made. But even as Selene threw herself into the preparations, part of her mind kept returning to Moira's earlier words. You are hope, and you are also the most dangerous weapon either side of this war could possess. What if the witch was wrong about which side would ultimately wield that weapon? The first anchor point lay in the Whispering Woods, a stretch of ancient forest where the trees grew so thick that sunlight never touched the ground. Even in peacetime, it was considered a place of ill omen. Local legends spoke of travelers who entered the woods and emerged days later with no memory of where they'd been. Or worse, emerged changed in ways that made their loved ones turn away in horror. Now, as Selene crouched behind a fallen log at the forest's edge, she could see why the Shadow King had chosen this place for his ritual. The very air seemed to writhe with unnatural energy, and shadows moved between the trees in patterns that had nothing to do with wind or wildlife. 30 shadow wolves, at least. Alaric murmured beside her, his enhanced senses counting enemies she couldn't yet see. Plus something larger in the center, something that doesn't feel like the others. The Anchor Guardian, Moira confirmed from his other side. The witch had insisted on accompanying them despite Alaric's protests, claiming her knowledge of Shadow Realm entities was too valuable to leave behind. Each anchor point will have one, a creature specifically bound to maintain the ritual circle. Selene closed her eyes, extending her newfound senses into the forest. The corruption was immediately apparent, like looking at a festering wound. But underneath the darkness, she could feel something else, something that had been there long before the Shadow King's influence arrived. This place was sacred once, she said suddenly. There's an old grove in there, isn't there? Something that was important to our people. Moira's pale eyes sharpened. Very good. Yes, there's a moon altar deep in the forest, one of the oldest in the kingdom, built when your ancestors first learned to speak with the goddess herself. That's why he chose it, Alaric realized. He's not just weakening the barriers between worlds, he's corrupting our most holy places. Desecration amplifies the effect, Moira agreed grimly. Turn a place of worship into a place of horror, and the spiritual damage resonates across dimensions. Commander Garrett appeared at Alaric's shoulder, his face painted with war paint that helped him blend into the shadows. Strike teams are in position. We can clear a path to the center, but it won't last long. It doesn't need to. Selene checked the crystal pendant Moira had given her, a focusing stone that would help channel her power more precisely. Once I reach the altar, I should be able to cleanse the corruption in minutes. Should, Alaric muttered. Will, she corrected firmly, though privately she shared his doubts. The theory was sound. Her amplifier abilities could theoretically purify corrupted ley lines just as easily as they could enhance a mate's power. But theory and practice were often very different things. A wolf's howl echoed through the forest, followed by another and another. Not the mechanical sounds of shadow wolves, but the real thing. Their own scouts reporting that enemy patrols were moving. Now or never, Garrett said. Alaric reached for Selene's hand, squeezing briefly. Through their bond, she felt his love, his fear, his absolute faith in her abilities even when she doubted herself. Together, he said. Together, she agreed. The attack began with a flight of arrows, each one wrapped in silver wire that would burn Shadow Wolf flesh on contact. Howls of pain and rage erupted from the forest as the creatures realized they were under assault. Then Alaric's strike teams moved in, and the real chaos began. Selene ran through the forest with inhuman speed, her awakened abilities allowing her to dodge between trees that would have been impassable obstacles weeks ago. Behind her, the sounds of battle grew louder as more enemies converged on their position. The corruption grew stronger the deeper they went. Soon every shadow seemed to hide eyes. Every rustle of leaves sounded like whispers in languages that predated human speech. The very air grew thick and oily, carrying scents that made her gag. They burst into a clearing just as something massive reared up from the center of what had once been a beautiful moon altar. The Guardian was like nothing from their world, a writhing mass of darkness and teeth and too many eyes, held together by malice and ancient hunger. Amplifier, it spoke, its voice like breaking glass. Come to cleanse what cannot be cleansed. Come to heal what chooses to be broken. Get back. Alaric moved to place himself between Selene and the creature, his sword blazing with power drawn from their bond. But the Guardian wasn't interested in him. It flowed around his attacks like smoke, reaching for Selene with appendages that shifted between shadow and substance. I have been waiting so long to taste one of your kind, it hissed. To learn the flavor of hope before I devour it entirely. Selene raised her hand, silver light blazing from her palm. The creature recoiled with a shriek, but she could see it wasn't truly hurt. Moira had been right. These things were specifically designed to resist her power. That's when she noticed something else. The altar beneath the Guardian wasn't completely corrupted. Deep in the ancient stone, She could sense the original blessing, the connection to the moon goddess that had sanctified this place centuries ago. Not through the guardian, she realized, through the altar itself. Instead of trying to fight the creature directly, she dropped to the ground and pressed her palms against the defiled stone. The original blessing was still there, buried under layers of darkness but not destroyed. If she could reach it, amplify it, power flowed through her like lightning, not the silver light of her own abilities, but the ancient gold radiance of divine blessing. The altar began to glow, cracks of pure light spreading across its surface like a spider's web. The guardian screamed as the expanding light touched it, its form beginning to dissolve. Impossible! The old ways are dead. The goddess has abandoned this realm. The goddess never abandons those who serve her, Selene said, pouring everything she had into the ancient stone. She only waits for them to remember how to listen. The corruption shattered like glass, taking the guardian with it. Light exploded upward from the altar in a pillar that could be seen for miles, cleansing not just this clearing but the entire forest around it. As the radiance faded, Selene collapsed into Alaric's arms, exhausted but triumphant. They'd done it. The first anchor point was cleansed, but even as relief flooded through their bond, she couldn't shake the feeling that this victory had been too easy. The Shadow King had ruled the darkness for centuries. Would he really leave his most important ritual sites so lightly defended? Something's wrong, she whispered. Alaric's grip tightened around her. What do you mean? Before she could answer, Commander Garrett came running through the trees, his face white with terror. Your Majesties, we have a problem. What kind of problem? Alaric demanded. The capital. Garrett's words came out in a rush. While we were here, they hit the capital. The real army wasn't in these woods. It was a diversion. The Shadow King himself is there, and he has... The commander's voice broke, and Selene felt her blood turn to ice. He has what? She asked, though part of her already knew. Hostages, Garrett whispered. Thousands of them. And he sent word that he'll execute one every hour until you return and surrender yourself to him. The forest spun around Selene as the full scope of the trap became clear. They'd been manipulated from the beginning, led away from the capital, so the real attack could succeed without her interference. How long do we have? Alaric asked, his voice deadly calm. The message was sent at dawn. That was... Garrett consulted the sun's position. 4 hours ago. 4 people were already dead because she'd fallen for the Shadow King's deception. 4 people who might still be alive if she'd seen through his plan. We have to go back, she said, struggling to her feet despite her exhaustion. It's a trap, Alaric protested. He wants you to come back. He's counting on your compassion to override your judgment. I know it's a trap. Selene met his eyes, letting him feel her resolve through their bond. But I can't let innocent people die for my cowardice. It's not cowardice to... It is if I'm the only one who can stop him. She touched the altar one more time, drawing strength from the newly cleansed blessing. We always knew it would come to this eventually. A direct confrontation between him and me. Together, Alaric said firmly. Whatever we face it together. Selene wanted to agree, wanted to promise him that they'd stand side by side against whatever waited for them in the capital. But as they prepared for the desperate ride back to save their people, she couldn't escape the growing certainty that some battles could only be won alone, and that the Shadow King was counting on her love for Alaric to be her ultimate weakness. The ride back to the capital took 6 hours, pushing their horses to the absolute limit of endurance. When the city finally came into view, Selene's heart nearly stopped. The entire population appeared to be gathered in the great square before the castle, pressed together in a mass of terrified humanity, while creatures of shadow and metal prowled the perimeter. Above them all, standing on a platform that definitely hadn't been there that morning, was a figure that hurt to look at directly, the Shadow King. He was beautiful in the way that poisonous things were beautiful. Perfect features that suggested rather than displayed the vast malevolence within. When he spoke, his voice carried across the entire city without effort. Brave Selene Arden, he called, though she was still miles away. I sense your approach. Come to me now, and I will make the deaths of your people swift and painless. Continue to resist, and I will make them last for days. As if to demonstrate his sincerity, he gestured to one of his servants. The creature dragged a struggling figure onto the platform, a young woman Celine recognized as one of the castle's seamstresses. "Please," the woman cried. "I have children." The Shadow King smiled. "Everyone here has someone they love. That's what makes this so deliciously tragic." His hand moved, almost casually, and the woman simply ended. Not killed, not destroyed, but erased so completely that for a moment Celine couldn't even remember what she'd looked like. 1 hour, the Shadow King announced. Then another, and another, until my dear Amplifier learns the price of defying me. Celine dug her heels into her horse's sides, desperate to reach the city before anyone else had to pay for her failures. But even as they raced through the outskirts of the capital, she knew the trap was already closing. The Shadow King wasn't just threatening her people to force her surrender. He was demonstrating that her power, her purpose, everything she'd learned about herself over the past weeks, none of it mattered if she couldn't protect the ones she loved. And in her heart, she was beginning to fear he might be right. The final confrontation was about to begin. And despite everything they'd learned, despite all their preparations and training and desperate hope, Celine still had no idea how to win a battle against an enemy who held her entire world hostage. But as they crested the final hill and saw the full scope of the Shadow King's forces arrayed against them, one thing became crystal clear. Win or lose, this nightmare ended tonight. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.